Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Please be seated. There's a story of a Sunday school teacher who was discussing the Ten Commandments with 5 and 6-year-olds. And after explaining the commandment to honor thy mother and thy father, she had asked, is there a commandment that teaches us how to treat our brothers and sisters? And one little boy, remembering the day before, where his 10-year-old brother had pinned him down and shoved a dandelion into his mouth that had gone to seed, blurted out, "Yeah, thou shalt not kill." In so doing, this brings us to the beginning of today's sermon. What Jesus does today, as he's addressing his disciples there in the Sermon on the Mount, is to fulfill or bring into focus the true meaning of the law. And what he wants to do is he wants us to see that there's a whole lot more to the law, to following the law, than what meets the eyes. He wants us to see that beyond just a quick superficial reading, that there's actually a deeper law that abides, that guides and governs the whole of how we are to behave. So in his gospel reading, he says to his disciples, "Except that your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now the first thing that Jesus wanted to do in saying this is that he wanted to set the bar higher for his followers and show them that it's not just the rote following of the commandments that's necessary, but if they want to obtain the good graces, the good blessings of God, to obtain eternal life, that they have to learn to do something more. Now, of course, he uses the scribes and the Pharisees as an example because the scribes and the Pharisees had this reputation of being able to, in one sense, meticulously uphold the law in all of its small, minor details, and yet at a deeper level, they often ignored its deepest dictates. And of course, Jesus gets right to the heart of that when he points out to the Pharisees and he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And these you ought to have done without neglecting the others." And what Jesus was getting at is perhaps not all, but there was a number of those who fit the bill as scribes and Pharisees who had made a practice, apparently, of preying upon the most vulnerable among them. Jesus said to them in another passage, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," again, hypocrites, "because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers, therefore you receive the greater condemnation." What the scribes and Pharisees would do then is they would keep the more smaller, the more minute, but the more visible details of the law, but they would often do it not to honor God, but more so for the praise of men. Jesus, again, what he's doing is trying to point back to the fact that there's something far deeper, far more meaningful to the law than just superficial customs. And it's not so much that God had neglected to inform the Jewish people of their responsibility to love their neighbor, as it was the fact that just by rote religious practice, many had fallen out of the habit of actually doing what was commanded. Indeed, if we take a look at Jesus' great commandment, what does he tell us? He tells us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And then to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Of course, the first part of that law comes right out of the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. But the second part of it then also comes out of the book of Leviticus, also in the Old Testament. So what Jesus is trying to do is he's trying to bring people's focus back on this deeper reality that animates the law. And that deeper reality, of course, is the law of love. I often think about what we do up here on Sunday. When most Sundays we rehearse the Great Commandment. But I particularly like these Sundays where we actually go through the 10 Commandments and then do the Great Commandment, because it reminds me, it's a reminder to me that those commandments can never truly be disconnected from God's directive that we should love, first of all, Him and love one another. By way of example, then, Jesus goes on to explain what he's talking about, and he uses then the sixth commandment as a teaching tool in today's gospel. And what Jesus does is he points out to us that it's not merely enough for us to avoid killing somebody, but that we have to learn to reject what underpins our motivations that lead to killing. And of course, the primary motivation there is this unjustified, acidic, unrighteous, unholy type of anger that sometimes takes hold of us. I think we've all seen examples of that, perhaps if we haven't done it ourselves, but in the world around us. For example, what happened at Broadway the other day. People get angry, and it spills out into fisticuffs. It's this toxic type of anger that Jesus is getting at. It's this anger that leads us into a life of loathing towards others, and this idea that everything in life is just cheap and dirty. And what he wants us to see is that as long as we hold on to this kind of attitude, this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and I have to get my revenge because you offended me. He says, as long as we hold on to these things, that is harmful. He says, even if it doesn't turn into outward murder of another human being, it's harmful. It harms our relationships with one another. And we might not think about it, but in addition to the victim that's harmed, it also harms the soul of the perpetrator. Of course, as we've seen daily, carried out to its most extreme manifestation, then of course, this toxic, wicked kind of anger that can lead to actual bodily murder. So Jesus, he gets to the heart of that particular idea of what murder really is, that it's not just the outward killing of somebody, but it starts inwardly in our hearts. And as he said one time, that what comes out of your mouth originates in the hearts, and if it's the wrong thing, it will defile us. And it's the same thing. What's in our hearts also is expressed through our hands. It not only defiles us, but our brothers and sisters. So as a prescription to this, of course, he follows up by telling us that if we want to worship our God and to honor our God, that if we have something against our brother or our sister, the first thing that we need to do, he says, is to leave your gift there at the altar. Go, make amends, and then come and make your offering to God. What's so toxic and so dangerous is this attitude of anger that leads into hatred, that St. John feels compelled to reiterate Jesus' teaching in his first epistle when he writes, anyone who hates another brother or sister is really a murderer at heart. And you know that murderers don't have eternal life within them. Excuse me. What Jesus is telling us then as his disciples is that we have to enter into a new and radical way of living, a deeper way of living in and for God, and that we can't just keep the commandments at the surface, but we have to undergo a change within our own hearts. Now we take a look at today's collect. We ask that God pour his love into us so that we would be moved to love him above all else, and then to obtain that promise, which, as our prayer had said, which exceed all that we can desire. Of course, what exceeds all that we can desire? What other than eternal life? Jesus' point, though, is that inasmuch as we harbor and cling to this destructive kind of anger, not necessarily the righteous anger that moves us to do good things and make changes, but this destructive anger that leads to killing, that God's love can never enter into our hearts. And without God being able then to enter into our hearts and plant his own love within us, then it's impossible for us to learn to love our neighbor. And then, as we neglect to do that particular duty to love our neighbor, it gets circular, and we cannot truly then honor God, we cannot truly love God. And of course, as John had pointed out, we cannot have eternal life within us. What Jesus wants us to do is he wants us to break out of the old cycle and break into the new cycle of divine love. To just jump on in and trust in him and leave it to him, leave it to the Spirit, leave it to the Father to help us to learn to love one another. In another sense, Jesus' whole point is that we as human beings, we can do all kinds of things that we think are righteous. We can donate money. We can cut a neighbor's grass. But if it's not done with the right intention, if it's not done with a love for that other person, desire to do good for them, then it's meaningless in the eyes of God. Indeed, we see on TV all these companies that, we donate to this cause, we donate to that cause, but it benefits them. It may benefit the other person, but they're not doing it out of love for neighbor. They're doing it because it benefits them and makes them look good in front of men, just like the Pharisees were accused of by Jesus. But Jesus, his whole point is that whatever we do that's good, do it with love. Let that be your motivator. And if we lack the love, and we continue in that path, and Jesus reminds us that like the Pharisees and the scribes, that we will receive the greater condemnation. This all reminds me of a story that I had read about Mother Teresa. She was asked once by somebody, what will we be judged on? And her response was, I believe that when we die, and the time comes for us to be judged, that God will ask us how many good, not ask us how many good things we did in our lives, but with how much love we did do the good things that we had done. I think Mother Teresa really got to the whole point of what Jesus was getting at. That it's not so much all the many things that we might do, and things that perhaps draw attention to ourselves, but it's the little things that we do that are motivated by love. Perhaps it's leaving a little note for our spouse, just saying, I love you, only because you truly do love them. Or perhaps going and checking on a neighbor because you care about them. That's what really matters to Jesus, more so than being able to keep ritual purity and tithing. Not that they're not important, but they have their ranking in the whole order of things. And the command to love is above all else. Jesus' radical love and dying for us then is that love of God, which we prayed for today, and it's that love of God that was already planted in us in our baptism. And what we're asking Christ to do, what we're asking to happen, is that God will help us to bring fruit out of this love that's been planted within us. This love, then, of Christ, what needs to happen for us, it needs to become the total force, the total motivating factor in our lives that directs our thoughts, our words, and our actions. And when we can finally do the good things that we do out of a complete motivation of love, then we can actually do what Jesus had said. He said, have your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And when we can do that, then of course we will have the gift of eternal life. But we'll also then come to realize the full meaning of what Jesus meant when he said that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So the bottom line is that we can do all sorts of good things. We can say all kinds of good things. We can earn praises of men. But it's that one little thing that we do in secret even, that only God sees, that's motivated by love, that really matters in the end. It's just something to think about in the week ahead. Amen. Remember the words of our Lord Jesus, how he said it, more blessed to give.